brilliant. It's genius. Yeah.
This guy was.
I'm sure you know he was the former head of MI6 and was so at the heart of British secret intelligence for nearly 40 years. Having served and posts across the world, he was head of MI6 during September the 11th attacks and the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Codenamed C, he is only the second holder of that position to be named publicly. He has subsequently expressed concerns over the growth of the use of surveillance in Britain, and in 2008 was asked to testify against allegations that MI6 were involved in the death of Princess Diana. He also tells me that I've damaged his reputation for punctuality by starting 5 minutes late, for which I apologise. But without further ado now, could you please put your hands together for Sir Richard Villa.
Intelligence officers always turn up exactly on time. You can work out why. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to talk principally in relation to the issue of Wikileaks tonight. And I'm happy to answer questions either on that or more widely on other subjects. So, the theme I've chosen is how much secrecy does the state need? And the short answer to that question is it needs some, but actually not as much as you think. And you may be surprised to hear me say that. But obviously, that needs to be significantly expanded. Now, the first thing I really want to mention is the idea of trends which underwrite our understanding of important contemporary events. It's not so much the trends as it were allowed to predict the future. They do maybe help you to understand the future better. And I would definitely draw a parallel at the moment between the wave of political unrest which is sweeping through the Middle East in a very exciting and rather extraordinary fashion, and also the Wikileaks phenomenon. Really, what ties these two events together, and of course a number of other events, is the diffusion of power away from states and the empowerment of individuals and small groups of individuals via new technology. And although I think we have understood for a significant amount of time already, there's a seismic shift of power happening in terms of this relationship between the state and the individual. We've really been much less good about anticipating what its consequences will be. Just 25 years ago, a few of you will certainly know what I'm talking about, the state actually had a monopoly of communications. But first of all, a word of warning about Wikileaks, and a word of warning about Egypt. In my experience in this sort of area, the media loves stories which is essentially about itself and projects the importance of the fifth estate. And I think our perception of both Wikileaks and of what's happening in Egypt is at the moment largely media driven. And if there's a purpose in my talk, I hope it's sort of rebalance the equation and give you a slightly different point of view. I mean, just a point about what's been happening in Cairo. It's not just about the discontent of a rising middle class in the face of a totalitarian government communicating through social networks. Bear in mind, when we're talking about Egypt, 44% of the population is illiterate and exists on less than $2 a day. And what you have to remember, and I haven't seen the BBC really as successive journalists who have presented themselves as the risk in this square. What what you have to bear in mind is that these forces in Egypt are also being unlocked by this extraordinary political change. And it's actually quite difficult to predict where this change will end up. And I'm happy to answer questions about Egypt, probably being one of the few people in this room, maybe anyone in this room, we certainly met Mubarak, and certainly met Omar Suleiman and other key players. Anyway, back to Wikileaks, because that's the issue I want to concentrate on in thinking about these very significant technological changes. Now, I think I would pose two key questions to begin with. How is the public interest actually served by official secrecy? And how is the public interest served by revelatory journalism? And it's very difficult to answer either of these questions with any precision because they're too broad and too indeterminate in their general sense. But they can be answered almost always on a case-by-case basis. And it's through, as it were, examining the particular incident and asking the questions that you end up, I think, with a body of decisions that create a measure against which to consider the specific. So the questions are, I'm not going to try to answer them, I'm just making sure that you realise that's the background. How is the public interest served by official secrecy? And how is the public interest served by revelatory journalism? But there are, as I've already indicated in talking about trends, further issues of principle which I'll also, I think, try to explain a bit further. The first is the extent to which technological advance is really altering the norms of civic and private life. And obviously the growth of social networks is the most obvious example of this. But they are shifting our perceptions of what might be described as public space and what might be designated as private and confidential space. I think most of you would accept in this room that individuals do require a degree of privacy, even if you have a tendency to give it up voluntarily on the internet. My advice is daily. And I think it would be generally accepted that most organisations, large and small, also require moments in their existence for the benefit of their members, confidentiality. However, there's absolutely no question that technology is significantly shifting these domains and altering the relationship quite fundamentally between citizen and government. And this is why the whole Wikileaks issue is very important. It dramatically highlights the problem. Now, it's quite extraordinary that if you read about Wikileaks in our rather tired media, I make no claims about that judgment, there isn't much consideration of the problems, but they do have urgency, and they do, as it were, or they should worry all of you. You know, we are being hit by a tidal wave of technological advance. So what I think is important in this is the Assange story as such is ultimately a distraction. He's a very undignified flag bearer, in my opinion, for a very important issue. And why do I think he is an undignified flag bearer? I'll give you several reasons. First, he's completely unable to explain why Wikileaks is doing what it's doing.
We support a cause that is no more radical a proposition than that the citizenry has a right to scrutinise the state.
Line them all up.
And when asked for reasons, and this is well documented, he always comes.
So let's talk a little more broadly about this. I mean, in general, what's your philosophy? Why is it right to encourage leaking of secret information?
Yeah, well, there's a question as to what sort of information is important in the world. What sort of information can achieve reform? And there's a lot of information. So information that organizations are spending economic effort into concealing, that's a really good signal that when the information gets out, there's a hope of it doing some good.
So he doesn't really know why he was doing it.
Militaries keep information secret to prosecute their part of a war, but also to hide abuse. And there is a military argument for keeping some information secret that is very timely. So an example of where troops are about to deploy. But that information expires quickly. And this information ranges from 2004 to 2010.
And the next reason I would say that if you're implying that governments protect themselves with a conspiracy of silence, and that we, the citizens, are victims of that conspiracy, it's a little unwise to behave conspiratorially yourself. And most sort of pressure groups that go down that track make a real effort to be transparent. I mean, Greenpeace is a very, very good example. And let's say its agenda is similar in a different area. And the third thing I would say is if you're charged with wrongdoing in a jurisdiction universally respected for its fairness and independence, the honourable way to behave is to face up to the situation, especially if you believe yourself to be innocent. And frankly, it is completely idiotic to suggest that the Swedish judiciary is being pressurised by sinister forces. If you really think that, you're into conspiracy theories and you have no real understanding of the way these government relations work. So what I see is that Assange has tethered himself to a vehicle that is much larger than him, much more important than him, but he's clearly enjoying the notoriety. And it seems to me that because of this unfortunate juxtaposition, the Wikileaks phenomenon seems to be no more sophisticated than government secrecy bad, full disclosure and absolute transparency good for the citizens, and let us show you how you're being viewed, i.e. it is disclosure for disclosure's sake. And frankly, I find that pretty insulting. And my advice is that you should think carefully if you don't feel that. And I especially dislike someone like Assange implying that he's actually acting in the public interest without any attempt to explain why and how. I think that one of the things that surprises me with the young people I talk to is their profligacy with their private information. My strong advice to you is be very, very careful what you actually put on social networks. And even if you erase it, it's actually still there and can be recovered. So take those decisions with care. And the last thing maybe to say, just to conclude, in talking about this sort of IT phenomenon, of course, it brings us all countless benefits, and I'm sure that none of you can imagine what your life would be like without it. And the balance is unquestionably positive. But it also creates incalculable potential for mischief. It amplifies threats from bullies and malign individuals. It empowers paedophiles, terrorists and extremists. It opens vast opportunities to technologically savvy criminals. And because of the speed at which massive data can be shared with millions, it puts us into a very equivocal and difficult position where there's no real way of understanding or judging what the the consequences of certain actions might be, because they can be broadcast and shifted across to so many people. And I think for that reason, I urge you to, as it were, think hard about Wikileaks phenomenon. Right, I'm going to stop there and we will have questions, I guess.
Well, I wonder how many of us will be purging our Facebooks tonight. Any questions? Anyone?
Maybe it's gossip and truth. Sorry.
No, I was really pleased that you spoke about public interest because I suppose the state and the employees of the state are ultimately hired by the public. For me, I don't find it in the public interest that there are hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dying, and especially civilians dying. On which point I'd like to come back to the Dowing memo, which I wish you'd have spoken about because it's something I'm really interested in. Really interested in.
Well, I'm telling you straight away that the short body require a long day to answer questions on Iraq at the moment. It's not technically such a deceit, but in practice it is such a deceit.
I'm not surprised that you are, but I'd just like to share it with the audience that what was in the Dowing memo that Sir Richard Dearlove said was that, having reported back on his recent talks in Washington, military action was now seen as inevitable, and Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. And I find that a terrible betrayal of everything that democracy is supposed to stand for, and that the intelligence service is supposed to provide. And having spoken about public interest and about Wikileaks, and I think it's terribly undignified, well, I think this kind of transparency is incredibly dignified, because to find out information like that, and that's what public servants are actually doing, and that's how intelligence is being used, I think that the most dignified way that we can recover from that is to find out that information and move on from there.
Just make one small point. The Downing Street memo table, which you just read, is a misquotation.
That it was provided from
And what I say is not on the public record.
so that was the memo.
And that's just a basic fact.
But was that not produced? Was that not given?